May we have your attention? Please take your seats as conference proceedings are about to commence. Thank you. Guests, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage your host, Wendy Austin.
Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the Whitla Hall for the final panel session of the day. I hope the workshops went well and that you all took the opportunity to voice your opinions and share your expertise in your groups. This panel will be reviewing the key recommendation that emerged from the workshops in which you all took part. The conversation will be led and moderated by Dr. Roberto Alvarez, Executive Director of the GFCC, and he'll be joined on stage by a truly international panel. Elvina Graham, who's Chair of Tourism NI, Professor Jim Metzen, Senior Advisor at the University of Auckland, Professor Nigel Scollin, who heads up the Institute of Global Food Security here at Queen's University, and Professor Padma Raghavan, Vice Provost for Research and Innovation and Chief Research Officer at Vanderbilt University. So big welcome for your panel, the final one for this evening. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody. This is the resilience panel, right? Because all of you who are here at this time, you are very resilient. Thank you so much for being here. So let me tell you one thing. I come from a place that has most of its land at the south of the equator. The name, it's called Brazil. That's where I come from. Have you ever heard about Brazil? Please raise your hand if you have heard about that country. Okay? Second question to the audience. What does come to your mind when someone talks about Brazil? Beach. What else? Caipirinha. Huh? Forest. We heard today that emissions resulting from agriculture correspond to 10% of the emissions in the UK. In Brazil, the use of land and agriculture corresponds to 47% of the emissions. And that is connected to the forest. We may see lots of discussions about the Amazon, deforestation, sustainability, etc. That will not be sorted out if we think only about the environment. There are 40 million people who live in the Amazon. That can only be addressed if we can build economic models that can generate income, that can really move forward the societies, the communities, the lives of the individuals in the Amazon. And if those two things happen, we will be able to talk environmental sustainability. It's very easy, I think, for all of us to think sustainability in terms of the environment, in terms of the economy, in terms of society. And my personal take, it's very hard to think at the intersection of those three things. And this is what I want to do here with our colleagues today. They were moderating the workshops that I hope you all have participated. And I will ask if you have. We were grading contributions for the workshops too. And what we want to do here is to capture some of the discussions, some of the insights, some of the recommendations that emerged from those workshops. I want to start with you, Jim. And I have a question for everybody. Let's say, quick question. What's the main insight that you gained?
From the workshop or from the full day?
You choose, from the workshop or the whole event?
From the workshop, we were discussing advancing resources utilization in the workshop. It surprised me how rapid that discussion went to the social as opposed to the logistical in terms of how you access resources. It came to the need to really engage engage with local communities and with countries in which those resources are being mined. And there are numerous examples, even in my corner of the world, in the South Pacific, in cases like Papua New Guinea and other places where, you know, we have been very heavy-handed, and the developed world has been very heavy-handed in terms of how it accesses resources and has not taken communities with it. And then you look at future technologies around AI, digital skills, and the building digital divide, which is actually getting worse across the world. The resources, and one critical resource is most certainly talent, and digital talent in particular. And that is very asymmetrically distributed. And again, if we're going to see advancing resources utilization, that must be for the benefit of communities in which those resources are found.
Great insight. Thanks for that. I think you mentioned that talent is underutilized, right? And if we think about the world, most of the people in the world today are in the liabilities column and not in the assets column of our societies. So I think it's a great point, but really getting to social. Elvina, what was the main insights that you gained?
So it was quite similar, actually, Roberta. We talked about at that intersection between, in our case, we were talking about seizing the decarbonisation agenda, you know, the opportunity that was there. And we talked a lot about how do you communicate that to the most impoverished people in your community, who really all that matters to them is where is the next meal coming from. And we're talking about words like sustainability or decarbonisation, which has no resonance with them whatsoever. So we talked about that. And then we also talked about African communities. We had Sunday Adeojo was on our panel, and he painted a very graphic picture of, in Nigeria, where he's from, you know, where you build up a lot of food waste in a day, then you burn it all down, because that's what you have to do, so that you can fill the same place tomorrow with more food waste, and you burn it all down. And that's the only way they can survive. And really thinking about decarbonisation is just not on their agenda. Now, I asked him, what can we do to help that? And it was quite simple. It's technology transfer backed by finance. He kept saying, we have the manpower, you have the technology. And it was quite a stark discussion, actually. Very good.
I think it's a great point about communication. I think it was amazing that we started the day with Professor Brian Cox, that in addition to being a researcher, he's a wonderful communicator. I think maybe, and this was one of the conversations that we had during the GFCC meeting, elites versus people on Main Street. If we don't develop the capacity to communicate, it would be hard to move forward these complex agendas. Mark, what was the main insight that you gained?
I think in the innovation for the energy space, it's clear that we understand where we need to go in terms of renewables, electrify everything, and somehow get the flexibility and storage to make that system work and be resilient. And the fact that system is becomes so complex and requires the integration of many decentralized resources and communities and customers and technologies, that it's much more than a technical problem. It's a social problem. It's a policy and government problem to accelerate this transition. And the innovation is much more than a technical issue.
That goes much beyond technology. As I say, did 3 Ds from electricity: decarbonization, digitalization, decentralization, right? And at the end, utilities will not be selling electrons. What will they sell? What are maybe the innovative business models that they should have in mind to advance those agendas? I'll leave that for the next round, but I think you touched upon exactly on that. Let's say it's not the technology itself. This is about the business models. It's about community engagement and more. Nigel, what was the main insight that you gained?
Well, really reflecting across the day, word inspiration and perhaps ambition were the two that are the most apparent to me, right from the beginning when we were listening to Brian Cox, all the way through the various panel discussions and through into the workshop that I was heading up, which is on food security and One Health. Now, much of that fits into what I would describe as the sort of the bigger challenges that we think about in society, and it made me reflect on the privilege it is to work in the area of agriculture, food, and to One Health. So just briefly, when we think about sort of grand challenges that people think about, society thinks about, then we're interested generally in our health. We're interested in our education and the education of our children. We're interested in where our food comes from. We're interested in biodiversity challenges, and we heard about biodiversity net gain. The wider environmental issues, and the challenges of climate and climate change and weather that we have to live with. And then I think about the one subject that connects all of that, and that is actually agriculture and what we do with land. And then the stark statistic that we heard from Baroness Batters this afternoon on the challenges, the global challenges in around the limited amount of land that we have to do all of these things from globally as well as nationally. It's really, really challenging. So I reflect really on the privilege and the inspiration, the ambition, the leadership that we need to give to society from agriculture and food to address those wider societal challenges.
Agriculture as a synthesis of all those challenges and potentially solutions.
Precisely. Now, I would warn you, moderator, I'm slightly biased, but I would argue that actually agriculture and food is the primary overall grand challenge, and is absolutely a way of connecting and synthesizing those wider grand challenges.
Padma, please.
So our workshop was around the question of how can science and technology innovation accelerate inclusivity and sustainability. So of course I dutifully asked that question. And very quickly, starting with the first panelist, we just pivoted. The answer was resoundingly that inclusivity accelerates innovation. And that's because, and by inclusivity we mean, communities that have not been involved, diversity of stakeholders, government, private sector, universities, but also things like politicians versus technologists, because it's about trust, building trust. And the young versus people who are more experienced. So diversity, and again, inclusivity, but with a global dimension, right? Because it might vary. In the US, for example, rural versus urban might be important in being inclusive. Somewhere else it could be quite different. But the bottom line was just that inclusivity accelerates innovation, and that there's no sustainability without inclusivity. So I think that's kind of the lesson here, that let's be inclusive, let's work together, because that's how we can bring about positive change.
So you are reframing in some way the understanding and hopefully action, right? So it's not innovation that will lead maybe to inclusiveness, but the opposite, where I think it's a fundamental insight.
I think you're spot on. I think, as we undertake this call to action, I think we need to be very mindful about being inclusive from the get-go, because that's what's going to help us really drive impact. And that was, again, another thing that came out both from the panelists as well as the audience.
Let's do a round now about recommendations. One of the ambitions that we had was to potentially identify some new ideas, some actionable ideas that would help us to move forward this agenda. I would start with you, Elvina. So, did you get into any concrete recommendations, maybe one or two that you would like to highlight?
I'm not sure they're concrete recommendations, but one of the very stark things that we talked about, again, was back to food. In Ireland, and these are really stark, 95% of apples are imported. you know, 90% of tomatoes being imported. I think it was 80% of onions were imported. And yet we're a country that can grow all these things. So the carbon, you know, the footprint of our food getting here is crazy. Now, what do we do about that? It's because we all want to buy things so cheaply. We want to go to the supermarket, pay as little as we can for our onions or our tomatoes. So there's definitely an education, and it nearly all comes back to education and to communication, I think, Roberto, because unless people understand that, unless I understand that, I didn't know those stats until today, you know, unless we can take that home to our own households and make a difference. So to me, that's all about communication. We talked a lot about the difference between Europe and Africa. I'm not sure of any answers to that one, but we explored that in a lot of detail. Yeah, we talked an awful lot. I could go on and on, but
Yeah.
you're
So
running out of time.
a concrete or a recommendation would be to increase local food production.
Absolutely.
There are various things related to that, communications, maybe some incentive systems, support,
There's lots of
whatever.
things. And do we have the right amount? I think it's something like 1% of the land in Ireland is used for horticulture. You know, I'm sure there's something that can be.
Nigel,
Yeah.
recommendations.
Yeah, well, I'd like to focus in really on the big message from the Food Security and One Health, for me, was actually the absolute critical importance of farmers in society. We heard the stark figure that the average age of a farmer in the UK, but also actually globally, is in around late 50s, early 60s. So attracting younger people into farming is a major challenge. Associated with that then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is actually what we do with land, because of the pressure on land and the limited availability of land to do all these tasks that land is required to do, and farmers and landowners are expected to deliver on. So it's really, really important to be cognizant of the importance of the farmer and the landowner. Secondly, it's around those farmers actually working together and learning together and sharing information. You know, we need to accelerate food production and those challenges that land delivers, including biodiversity, net gain, and other wider environmental challenges. You know, these are massive pressures on land and farmers to deliver. So actually creating knowledge and sharing knowledge is very, very important. And doing that in partnership and working together, not just farmers to farmers, but actually across supply chains and with wider society, because it is just the most critical sector. And we need to be responsible for the leadership, the investment, the passion and ambition that we demonstrate as members of society to agriculture.
Are there any awards or prizes to recognize farmers?
Yes, at a national and at a global level. And that's of course, like other business sectors, they're very important awards locally, nationally, globally. But we need to do more to promote and to communicate that to wider society.
Jim, any recommendations about the use of natural resources?
Well, your comment about supply chains as it applies to our food issue, this is equally, if not more so, with regard to distribution of resources. If we look at the just energy transition, for example, we'll be dependent on huge increases in vital minerals, elements that we need. At a time of hardening borders, of geopolitical tensions across the world, this disorderly world that Chad refers to, where actually the number of forums where you can have a neutral discussion about resource utilization, where you can build, in fact, any level of social license around how those are used, is decreasing at the moment. We have a real challenge, I think, in finding the sort of forums, and this is actually one, where those discussions can be held.
So to advance the agenda, we need spaces for conversations in which people can be exposed to different worldviews, perceptions, and work together.
If social license is going to be found
Yeah.
for those things, we need the communication into societies, the discussions with communities that enable that, and they must see benefit from the directions that we are proposing.
Mark, recommendations about energy.
My recommendation cuts across almost everything. You know, obviously, artificial intelligence is a big part of the solution from innovation point of view, but the recommendation is about data, because data is underneath everything that we do. It's our understanding, it's our basis of innovation, and we need to make data open. We need to have open access to all kinds of data. We need to share the data. That's the basis of our innovations and calculations, large data sets, whether it's energy use or infrastructure characteristics or failure data or weather data or storm data. Sharing it accelerates the innovation process so much in terms of researchers being able to use it and developing applications, and too much data is still dark and hidden to researchers.
You were talking about data commons in some way. Do you have any benchmarks in mind? If you could point to one example, one case where that is happening and that we could in some way use as an inspiration, what would come to your mind?
Well, I think we're starting to see it happen in Europe. Has an initiative called Data Spaces, where we're trying to create a open data platform for everything that a community and an energy community and energy infrastructure participants, stakeholders can use that same data to develop applications that support more efficient energy use and generation and storage and participation in flexibility requirements for the grid. That's one example. The UK is a leader in that space as well, in terms of publishing information about the energy infrastructure and allowing third parties to look at that and have more than one entity working on where the bottlenecks are in the system and where we might be able to add more renewables. There's a few good examples out there. Not too many of them are in the US yet.
Padma, recommendations.
So I think, the idea was that technology is important, but it's not about creating new technologies, but rather taking a portfolio approach of technologies that exist now and could be created. But that's just the first step. We have to think of it in terms of the impact it's going to have on communities, and that needs to be built in from day one. Because when you build trust and the communities benefit, I think that's when it becomes sustainable in the longer term. And along this sort of mindset, another thought was that, yes, make it valuable for communities now, but also think of the long term, because if you put in place a technology today that has long-term consequences for the environment, well, then we are really, not supporting sort of the next generation. So the long term, the short term, but really focus on people, but think of technologies in the context of people.
In some way, it's technology assessment with a societal perspective, life cycle. You've been leading research projects, research initiatives. What would you do first to make progress in that direction?
I think it really goes back to having everybody in the community involved on day one, right? Because you can have the technologists involved with the community leaders, involved with, the various elements of the society, and say, what makes sense here? Because, a solution that works in California is not necessarily going to work in Africa or Romania, so of course geography matters, but really look at it from the community perspective, the technology portfolio, and make it sustainable, and then scale up through information exchange and understanding that there's so many global dimensions.
Let me ask you a final question here, that there are two different questions, and you can pick one to answer, or you can answer both. I'll give it a chance, right? The first question is, are there any opportunities that we are not seeing? What is in the blind spot in relation to the domains, the fields in which you are experts and you led these workshops, but also what's something that really is innovative that you see in the world related to that? A new business model, a transformational research project, a community project that is transformational? You can answer both or pick one. Who's going to go first? Nigel.
Yeah, I always worry about the question that's who's had the original thought. I was badly bruised when I sat at a table many years ago with 5 eminent professors when they had the discussion, who's had the original thought, and I don't think any of them had an original thought. However, I will put forward in terms of one of the critical spaces in around agriculture and food, and it was noted to some extent today in the wider discussions as well, is just the whole area of waste and waste valorization. And it's about effectively how we can recapture nutrients from the entire food system and recycle back in. Okay? So it may not be an original thought, but there's a huge opportunity to capture nutrients and drive circularity in our agriculture and our food production systems. And aligned with that, we need two major areas, really. The science for much of this does exist, at least at an experimental scale, but we need investment into scaling technologies and driving that up to field level application.
I love that. I told you guys I come from Brazil. Brazil produces 40 billion liters of ethanol every year. Yep. That's 32 million tons, metric tons of ethanol. Yep. It happens that in the fermentation process, for each mass unit of ethanol, there's 1 mass unit of CO2 that's released. Ethanol in general is net zero, but those 32 million tons of CO2, they're being released. Well, some of them we are using for sodas, right? What a big opportunity to use that and as an input to a next process, to create value with that waste.
Yeah. And I think what this will do in terms of food and agriculture is dramatically reduce its overall environmental footprint.
Mark.
You know, when I first came to Ireland in 2000, there was 2 things that impressed me. One was that they had a poet as the guy doing a commercial at halftime of a Gaelic football game for Toyota. That would have never happened in the U.S. But the other thing was a concept called tidy towns, which I still love. And it really illustrates to me the power of the community as we were talking. And I think that one of the things that we need is we need to empower the individual and the community to be the innovators in the energy transition. And they will do it, but we need to help them. We need to help them with policy and tools and you know, get them started. And then individuals will take the incentive and the community will take the incentive to make it happen if we can empower them.
Elvina, any opportunities, any models that everybody should be aware of?
Now, we talked a lot in our group today about, a bit like what we just talked about there actually, about how we needed to have the small guy, the small company is where a lot of the innovation's happening, yet they are the ones that are struggling the most. They can't get funding, they can't understand policies, they can't get into government. You know, there's just so many barriers to them, and yet they are the guys who have the potential to help us, particularly in places like Africa, to leapfrog and to, you know, miss out a lot of the steps that we've had to take in the Western world. And it's all about how do we make them much faster, a much slicker process, more funding. Now, that's not rocket science, but it's something that needs to happen and needs to happen quickly.
And that maybe a lot of people need to hear about this,
yes,
and the
true.
importance of doing that. Jim.
Yes, a couple of things, I guess. I go to focus on circular economies and how critical it is that communities are able to be part of that and drive those, because that's where the impetus needs to come from. And circularity actually poses also a number of critical research questions. If I go back to my roots as a materials scientist, it drives us into the top of the periodic table. Those are not only things we have a lot of in terms of the world, but also they are the things that we know how to recycle by and large. And I look at the comments earlier today about moving battery technologies or other technologies into simpler composition. So there is a huge research question and research opportunity around how we better enable that and how we motivate societies to drive towards those objectives.
Any recommendations specific related to that?
I think these things are always very complex, and because I think of our discussion today and the different positions that different countries are in, where many do not have the luxury of thinking in that way or towards SDG goals, for example, and that, because there is an immediate need to lift the opportunities for people and lift the standards of living. And that will involve, in the short term, energy and all of the things. But we must play the long game as well in this, I guess, in terms of making available technologies which are simpler, greener, and more circular.
Padma, recommendations.
I think, circularity could be certainly leveraged. Circularity, can be the opportunity. But then there's also this concern about complexity. These are very complex, interrelated systems, and so we want to be thoughtful that if we introduce one technology, it doesn't have long-term consequences that get in the way of something else, or maybe a particular industrial sector or an economic sector. So understanding complexity, leveraging circularity, but most of all, I think bringing together an inclusive community that can just make sure that the ideas are tested from multiple directions before you try to take it and implement it.
I think that we're getting to the end of our panel. I heard three things here. The first is that technology is not constraining us. Social constructs are, business models, institutions. And this is something that we heard here over the day too. The second thing, and I believe that emerged from various of the workshops and your comments, it's about people and communities, reinforcing, stressing social bonds, and betting on that as transformational agents, communities as transformational agents. And the third thing, it's about engagement. I think we heard during the conference, we heard a lot from Queens about engagement. I remember Professor Ian Greer commenting about that, and I heard from various of you, engaging, communicating, because especially one thing, the short term imposes itself. So there's a huge need, even for people who know that SMEs are important, to communicate, to stress that need, to engage with communities, to try to translate complex things. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our colleagues.
Roberto, Mark, Jim, Nigel, Padma and Elvina, thank you very much indeed for that very good summary of this afternoon and of today. I think, as we would say here in Northern Ireland, taxi for Roberto and crew. I think the bus is virtually outside, and I'm aware I'm between you and the Titanic and dinner. I just wanted to say a very quick thank you to all of our excellent speakers today, to our wonderful panelists, to all of you delegates for being here, for being engaged and contributing your thoughts, your ideas and your expertise. Thanks to Sir Ian and the whole Queen's family and everyone behind the scenes who's put this together and made it work today. I hope you've all enjoyed your first full day here at the 2024 Global Innovation Summit at Queen's. I've loved joining you today. I'll be keeping a close eye on live stream for the rest of the week. You'll be in good hands tomorrow with my colleague Mark Simpson. Enjoy the rest of the summit and enjoy your week in Belfast. I hope the weather stays good for you. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.